This week's Grimm Fairy Tales, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Once upon a time, in the middle of winter, when the flakes of snow were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat at a window sewing, and the frame of the window was made of black ebony. And while she was sewing and looking out of the window at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell upon the snow. And the red looked pretty upon the white snow, and she thought to herself, "Would that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the window frame." Soon after that, she had a little daughter, who was as white as snow, and as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. And she was therefore called Little Snow White. And when the child was born, the queen died. After a year had passed, the king took to himself another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but proud and haughty, and she could not bear that anyone else should surpass her in beauty. She had a wonderful looking glass, and when she stood in front of it and looked at herself in it and said, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The looking glass answered, "Thou, O queen, art the fairest of all." Then she was satisfied, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. But Snow White was growing up, and grew more and more beautiful, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day, and more beautiful than the queen herself. And once when the queen asked her looking glass, looking glass, on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered, "Thou art fairer than all who are here, Lady Queen, but more beautiful still is Snow White, as I ween." Then the queen was shocked, and turned yellow and green with envy. From that hour, whenever she looked at Snow White, her heart heaved in her breast. She hated the girl so much, and envy and pride grew higher and higher in her heart like a weed, so that she had no peace day or night. She called a huntsman and said, "Take the child away into the forest. I will no longer have her in my sight. Kill her and bring me back her heart as a token." The huntsman obeyed and took her away. But when he had drawn his knife and was about to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and said, "Ah, dear huntsman, leave me my life. I will run away into the wild forest and never come home again." And as she was so beautiful, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Run away then, you poor child. The wild beasts will soon have devoured you," thought he. And yet it seemed as if a stone had been rolled from his heart, since it was no longer needful for him to kill her. And as a young boar just then came running by, he stabbed it and cut out its heart and took it to the queen as proof that the child was dead. The cook had to salt this, and the wicked queen ate it, and thought she had eaten the heart of Snow White. But now the poor child was all alone in the great forest, and so terrified that she looked at every leaf of every tree and did not know what to do. Then she began to run, and ran over sharp stones and through thorns, and the wild beasts ran past her, but did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would go until it was almost evening. Then she saw a little cottage and went into it to rest herself. Everything in the cottage was small, but neater and cleaner than can be told. There was a table on which was a white cover, and 7 little plates, and on each plate a little spoon. Moreover, there were 7 little knives and forks, and 7 little mugs. Against the wall stood 7 little beds side by side, and covered with snow white counterpanes. Little Snow White was so hungry and thirsty that she ate some vegetables and bread from each plate, and drank a drop of wine out of each mug, for she did not wish to take all from one only. Then, as she was so tired, she laid herself down on one of the little beds, but none of them suited her. One was too long, one too short, but at last she found that the seventh one was right, and so she remained in it, said a prayer, and went to sleep. When it was quite dark, the owners of the cottage came back. They were 7 dwarfs who dug and delved in the mountains for ore. They lit their 7 candles, and as it was now light within the cottage, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not in the same order in which they had left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting in my chair?" The second, "Who has been eating off my plate?" The third, "Who has been taking some of my bread?" The fourth, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh, "Who has been drinking out of my mug?" Then the first looked round and saw that there was a little hole on his bed, and he said, "Who has been getting into my bed?" The others came up and each called out, "Somebody has been lying in my bed too." But the seventh, when he looked at his bed, saw little Snow White, who was lying asleep therein. And he called the others, who came running up, and they cried out with astonishment, and brought their 7 little candles, and let the light fall on little Snow White. "Oh heavens! Oh heavens!" cried they. "What a lovely child!" And they were so glad that they did not wake her up, but let her sleep on in the bed. And the 7th dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so got through the night. When it was morning, little Snow White awoke, and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarfs. But they were friendly and asked her what her name was. "My name is Snow White," she answered. "How have you come to our house?" said the dwarfs. Then she told them that her stepmother had wished to have her killed, but that the huntsman had spared her life, and that she had run for the whole day until at last she found their dwelling. The dwarf said, "If you will take care of our house, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and if you will keep everything neat and clean, you can stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And she stayed with them. She kept the house in order for them. In the mornings, they went to the mountains and looked for copper and gold. In the evenings, they came back, and then their supper had to be ready. The girl was alone the whole day, so the good dwarfs warned her and said, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know that you are here. Be sure to let no one come in." But the queen, believing that she had eaten Snow White's heart, could not but think that she was again the first and most beautiful of all. And she went to her looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And the glass answered, "O queen, thou art fairest of all I see. But over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is alive and well, and none is so fair as she." Then she was astounded, for she knew that the looking-glass never spoke falsely, and she knew that the huntsman had betrayed her, and that little Snow White was still alive. And so she thought and thought again how she might kill her, for so long as she was not the fairest in the whole land, envy let her have no rest. And when she had at last thought of something to do, she painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, and no one could have known her. In this disguise she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, and knocked at the door and cried, "Pretty things to sell, very cheap, very cheap." Little Snow White looked out of the window and called out, "Good day, my good woman. What have you to sell?" "Good things, pretty things," she answered. "Stay laces of all colors." And she pulled out one which was woven of bright-colored silk. "I may let the worthy old woman in," thought Snow White, and she unbolted the door and bought the pretty laces. "Child," said the old woman, "what a fright you look. Come, I will lace you properly for once." Snow White had no suspicion but stood before her, and let herself be laced with the new laces. But the old woman laced so quickly and so tightly that Snow White lost her breath and fell down as if dead. "Now I am the most beautiful," said the queen to herself, and ran away. Not long afterwards in the evening the 7 dwarfs came home. But how shocked they were when they saw their dear little Snow White lying on the ground, and that she neither stirred nor moved, and seemed to be dead. They lifted her up, and as they saw that she was laced too tightly, they cut the laces. When she began to breathe a little, and after a while came to life again, when the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no one else than the wicked queen. Take care and let no one come in when we are not with you." But the wicked woman, when she had reached home, went in front of the glass and asked, "Looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" And it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard that, all her blood rushed to her heart with fear, for she saw plainly that little Snow White was alive again. "But now," she said, "I will think of something that shall put an end to you." And by the help of witchcraft, which she understood, she made a poisonous comb. Then she disguised herself and took the shape of another old woman. So she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs, knocked at the door and cried, "Good things to sell, cheap, cheap." Little Snow White looked out and said, "Go away, I cannot let anyone come in." "I suppose you can look," said the old woman, and pulled the poisonous comb out and held it up. It pleased the girl so well that she let herself be beguiled, and opened the door. When they had made a bargain, the old woman said, "Now I will comb you properly for once." Poor little Snow White had no suspicion, and let the old woman do as she pleased. But hardly had she put the comb in her hair than the poison in it took effect, and the girl fell down senseless. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "you are done for now." And she went away. But fortunately, it was almost evening when the 7 dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying as if dead upon the ground, they at once suspected the stepmother, and they looked and found the poisoned comb. Scarcely had they taken it out when Snow White came to herself, and told them what had happened. Then they warned her once more to be upon her guard, and to open the door to no one. The queen at home went in front of the glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" Then it answered as before, "O Queen, thou art fairest of all I see, but over the hills where the 7 dwarfs dwell, Snow White is still alive and well, and none is so fair as she." When she heard the glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." Thereupon she went into a quite secret, lonely room where no one ever came, and there she made a very poisonous apple. Outside it looked pretty, white with a red cheek, so that everyone who saw it longed for it, but whoever ate a piece of it must surely die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face, and dressed herself up as a country woman, and she went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarfs. She knocked at the door. Snow White put her head out of the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarfs have forbidden me." "It is all the same to me," answered the woman. "I shall soon get rid of my apples. There, I will give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I dare not take anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You eat the red cheek, and I will eat the white." The apple was so cunningly made that only the red cheek was poisoned. Snow White longed for the fine apple, and when she saw that the woman ate part of it, she could resist no longer, and stretched out her hand and took the poisonous half. But hardly had she a bite of it in her mouth than she fell down dead. Then the queen looked at her with a dreadful look and laughed aloud and said, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony wood. This time the dwarfs cannot wake you up again." And when she asked of the looking-glass at home, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" it answered at last, "O Queen, in this land thou art fairest of all." Then her envious heart had rest, so far as an envious heart can have rest. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying upon the ground. She breathed no longer and was dead. They lifted her up, looked to see whether they could find anything poisonous, unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine. But it was all of no use. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. They laid her upon a bier, and all 7 of them sat around it and wept for her, and wept 3 days long. And all 7 of them sat around it and wept for her, and wept 3 days long. Then they were going to bury her, but she still looked as if she were living, and still had her pretty red cheeks. They said, "We could not bury her in the dark ground." And they had a transparent coffin of glass made, so that she could be seen from all sides. And they laid her in it, and wrote her name upon it in golden letters, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they put the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always stayed by it and watched it. And birds came too, and wept for Snow White. First an owl, then a raven, and at last a dove. And now Snow White lay a long, long time in the coffin, and she did not change, but looked as if she were asleep. For she was as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that a king's son came into the forest, and went to the dwarf's house to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain, and the beautiful Snow White within it, and read what was written upon it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarfs answered, "We will not part with it for all the gold in the world." Then he said, "Let me have it as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and prize her as my dearest possession." As he spoke in this way, the good dwarfs took pity upon him, and gave him the coffin. And now the king's son had it carried away by his servants on their shoulders. And it happened that they stumbled over a tree stump, and with the shock, the poisonous piece of apple which Snow White had bitten off came out of her throat. And before long, she opened her eyes, lifted up the lid of the coffin, sat up, and was once more alive. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The king's son, full of joy, said, "You're with me," and told her what had happened, and said, "I love you more than everything in the world. Come with me to my father's palace, you shall be my wife." And Snow White was willing, and went with him, and their wedding was held with great show and splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast. When she had arrayed herself in beautiful clothes, she went before the looking-glass and said, looking glass on the wall, who in this land is the fairest of all?" The glass answered, "O Queen, of all here the fairest art thou, but the young queen is fairer by far, as I trow." Then the wicked woman uttered a curse, and was so wretched, so utterly wretched, that she knew not what to do. At first she would not go to the wedding at all, but she had no peace, and must go to see the young queen. And when she went in, she knew Snow White, and she stood still with rage and fear, and could not stir. But iron slippers had already been put upon the fire, and they were brought in with tongs, and set before her. Then she was forced to put on the red-hot shoes and dance until she dropped down dead. The shoes that were danced to pieces. There was once upon a time a king who had 12 daughters, each one more beautiful than the other. They all slept together in one chamber, in which their beds stood side by side, and every night when they were in them, the king locked the door and bolted it. But in the morning, when he unlocked the door, he saw that their shoes were worn out with dancing, and no one could find out how that could have come to pass. Then the king caused it to be proclaimed that whosoever could discover where they danced at night should choose one of them for his wife, and be king after his death, but that whosoever came forward and had not discovered it within 3 days and nights should have forfeited his life. It was not long before a king's son presented himself and offered to undertake the enterprise. He was well received, and in the evening was led into a room adjoining the princess's sleeping chamber. His bed was placed there, and he was to observe where they went and danced, and in order that they might do nothing secretly or go away to some other place, the door of their room was left open. But the eyelids of the prince grew heavy as lead, and he fell asleep, and when he awoke in the morning, all 12 had been to the dance, for their shoes were standing there with holes in the soles. On the second and third nights, it fell out just the same, and then his head was struck off without mercy. Many others came after this and undertook the enterprise, but all forfeited their lives. Now it came to pass that a poor soldier, who had a wound and could serve no longer, found himself on the road to the town where the king lived. There he met an old woman, who asked him where he was going. "I hardly know myself," answered he, and added in jest, "I had half a mind to discover where the princesses danced their shoes into holes, and thus become king." "That is not so difficult," said the old woman. "You must not drink the wine which will be brought to you at night, and must pretend to be sound asleep." With that, she gave him a little cloak and said, "If you put on that, you will be invisible, and then you can steal after the 12. When the soldier had received this good advice, he went into the thing in earnest, took heart, went to the king and announced himself as a suitor. He was as well received as the others, and royal garments were put upon him. He was conducted that evening at bedtime into the antechamber, and as he was about to go to bed, the eldest came and brought him a cup of wine, but he had tied a sponge under his chin, and let the wine run down into it, without drinking a drop. Then he lay down, and when he had lain a while, he began to snore as if in the deepest sleep. The 12 princesses heard that and laughed, and the eldest said, "He too might as well have saved his life." With that they got up, opened wardrobes, presses, cupboards, and brought out pretty dresses, dressed themselves before the mirrors, sprang about and rejoiced at the prospect of the dance. Only the youngest said, "I know not how it is you are very happy, but I feel very strange. Some misfortune is certainly about to befall us." "Thou art a goose, who art always frightened," said the oldest. "Hast thou forgotten how many kings' sons have already come in vain? I had hardly any need to give the soldier a sleeping draught. In any case, the clown would not have awakened." When they were all ready, they looked carefully at the soldier, but he had closed his eyes and did not move or stir, so they felt themselves quite secure. The eldest then went to her bed and tapped it. It immediately sank into the earth, and one after the other they descended through the opening, the eldest going first. The soldier, who had watched everything, tarried no longer, put on his little cloak, and went down last with the youngest. Halfway down the steps, he just trod a little on her dress. She was terrified at that, and cried out, "What is that? Who's pulling my dress?" "Don't be silly," said the eldest. "You have caught it on a nail." Then they went all the way down, and when they were at the bottom, they were standing in a wonderfully pretty avenue of trees, all the leaves of which were of silver, and shone and glistened. The soldier thought, "I must carry a token away with me," and broke off a twig from one of them, on which the tree cracked with a loud report. The youngest cried out again, "Something is wrong. Did you hear the crack?" But the eldest said, "It is a gun fired for joy because we have got rid of our prince so quickly." After that, they came into an avenue where all the leaves were of gold, and lastly into a third where they were of bright diamonds. He broke off a twig from each, which made such a crack each time that the youngest started back in terror. But the eldest still maintained that they were salutes. They went on and came to a great lake whereon stood 12 little boats, and in every boat sat a handsome prince, all of whom were waiting for the 12, and each took one of them with him. But the soldier seated himself by the youngest. Then her prince said, "I can't tell why the boat is so much heavier today. I shall have to row with all my strength if I am to get it across." "What should cause that?" said the youngest. "But the warm weather?" "I feel very warm too." On the opposite side of the lake stood a splendid, brightly lit castle, from whence resounded the joyous music of trumpets and kettle drums. They rode over there, entered, and each prince danced with the girl he loved. But the soldier danced with them unseen, and when one of them had a cup of wine in her hand, he drank it up, so that the cup was empty when she carried it to her mouth. The youngest was alarmed at this, but the eldest always made her be silent. They danced there till 3 o'clock in the morning, when all the shoes were danced into holes, and they were forced to leave off. The princes rowed them back again over the lake, and this time the soldier seated himself by the eldest. On the shore they took leave of their princes, and promised to return the following night. When they reached the stairs, the soldier ran on in front and lay down in his bed, and when the 12 had come up slowly and wearily, he was already snoring so loudly that they could all hear him, and they said, "So far as he is concerned, we are safe." They took off their beautiful dresses, laid them away, put the worn-out shoes under the bed, and lay down. Next morning the soldier was resolved not to speak, but to watch the wonderful goings-on, and again went with them. Then everything was done just as it had been done the first time, and each time they danced until their shoes were worn to pieces. But the third time, he took a cup away with him as a token. When the hour had arrived for him to give his answer, he took the 3 twigs and the cup, and went to the king. But the 12 stood behind the door, and listened for what he was going to say. When the king put the question, "Where have my 12 daughters danced their shoes to pieces in the night?" he answered, "In an underground castle with 12 princes," and related how it had come to pass, and brought out the tokens. The king then summoned his daughters, and asked them if the soldier had told the truth. And when they saw that they were betrayed, and that falsehood would be of no avail, they were obliged to confess all. Thereupon the king asked which of them he would have to wife. He answered, "I am no longer young, so give me the eldest." Then the wedding was celebrated on the self-same day, and the kingdom was promised him after the king's death. But the princes were bewitched for as many days as they had danced nights with the 12. The boots of buffalo leather. A soldier who is afraid of nothing troubles himself about nothing. One of this kind had received his discharge, and as he had learnt no trade and could earn nothing, he traveled about and begged alms of kind people. He had an old waterproof on his back, and a pair of riding boots of buffalo leather which were still left to him. One day he was walking, he knew not where, straight out into the open country, and at length came to a forest. He did not know where he was, but saw sitting on the trunk of a tree, which had been cut down, a man who was well dressed and wore a green shooting coat. The soldier shook hands with him, sat down on the grass by his side, and stretched out his legs. "I see thou hast good boots on, which are well blackened," said he to the huntsman. "But if thou hadst to travel about as I have, they would not last long. Look at mine, they are of buffalo leather, and have been worn for a long time, but in them I can go through thick and thin." After a while the soldier got up and said, "I can stay no longer. Hunger drives me onwards. But brother Bright Boots, where does this road lead to?" "I don't know that myself," answered the huntsman. "I have lost my way in the forest." "Then thou art in the same plight as I," said the soldier. "Birds of a feather flock together. Let us remain together and seek our way." The huntsman smiled a little, and they walked on further and further until night fell. "We do not get out of the forest," said the soldier, "but there in the distance I see a light shining, which will help us to something to eat." They found a stone house, knocked at the door, and an old woman opened it. "We are looking for quarters for the night," said the soldier, "and some lining for our stomachs, for mine is as empty as an old knapsack." "You cannot stay here," answered the old woman. "This is a robber's house, and you would do wisely to get away before they come home, or you will be lost." "It won't be so bad as that," answered the soldier. "I have not had a mouthful for 2 days, and whether I am murdered here or die of hunger in the forest is all the same to me. I shall go in." The huntsman would not follow, but the soldier drew him in with him by the sleeve. "Come, my dear brother, we shall not come to an end so quickly as that." The old woman had pity on them and said, "Creep in here behind the stove, and if they leave anything, I will give it to you on the sly when they are asleep." Scarcely were they in the corner before 12 robbers came bursting in, seated themselves at the table, which was already laid, and vehemently demanded some food. The old woman brought in some great dishes of roast meat, and the robbers enjoyed that thoroughly. When the smell of the food ascended the nostrils of the soldier, he said to the huntsman, "I cannot hold out any longer. I shall seat myself at the table and eat with them." "Thou wilt bring us to destruction," said the huntsman, and held him back by the arm. But the soldier began to cough loudly. When the robbers heard that, they threw away their knives and forks, leapt up and discovered the 2 who were behind the stove. "Aha, gentlemen, are you in the corner?" cried they. "What are you doing here? Have you been sent as spies? Wait a while, and you shall learn how to fly on a dry bow." "But do be civil," said the soldier. "I am hungry. Give me something to eat, and then you can do what you like with me." The robbers were astonished, and the captain said, "I see that thou hast no fear. Well, thou shalt have some food, but after that thou must die." "We shall see," said the soldier, and seated himself at the table, and began to cut away valiantly at the roast meat. "Brother Bright Boots, come and eat," cried he to the huntsman. "Thou must be as hungry as I am, and cannot have better roast meat at home." But the huntsman would not eat. The robbers looked at the soldier in astonishment and said, "The rascal uses no ceremony." After a while he said, "I have had enough food. Now get me something good to drink." The captain was in the mood to humor him in this also, and called to the old woman, "Bring a bottle out of the cellar, and mind it be of the best." The soldier drew the cork out with a loud noise, and then went with the bottle to the huntsman and said, "Pay attention, brother, and thou shalt see something that will surprise thee. I am now going to drink the health of the whole clan." Then he brandished the bottle over the heads of the robbers and cried, "Long life to you all, but with your mouths open and your right hands lifted up." And then he drank a hearty draught, Scarcely were the words said than they all sat motionless as if made of stone, and their mouths were open and their right hands stretched up in the air. The huntsman said to the soldier, "I see that thou art acquainted with tricks of another kind, but now come and let us go home." "Oh, my dear brother, but that would be marching away far too soon. We have conquered the enemy, and must first take the booty. Those men there are sitting fast and are opening their mouths with astonishment, but they will not be allowed to move until I permit them. Come, eat and drink." The old woman had to bring another bottle of the best wine, and the soldier would not stir until he had eaten enough to last for 3 days. At last, when day came, he said, "Now, it is time to strike our tents, and that our march may be a short one, the old woman shall show us the nearest way to the town." When they had arrived there, he went to his old comrades and said, "Out in the forest I have found a nestful of gallows birds. Come with me and we will take it." The soldier led them, and said to the huntsman, "Thou must go back again with me to see how they shake when they seize them by the feet." He placed the men round about the robbers, and then he took the bottle, drank a mouthful, brandished it above them, and cried, "Live again." Instantly they all regained the power of movement, but were thrown down and bound hand and foot with cords. Then the soldier ordered them to be thrown into a cart, as if they had been so many sacks, and said, "Now drive them straight to prison." The huntsman, however, took one of the men aside and gave him another commission besides. "Brother Brightboots," said the soldier, "we have safely routed the enemy and been well fed. Now we will quietly walk behind them as if we were stragglers." When they approached the town, the soldier saw a crowd of people pouring through the gate of the town, who were raising loud cries of joy and waving green bows in the air. Then he saw that the entire bodyguard was coming up. "What can this mean?" said he to the huntsman. "Dost thou not know?" he replied, "that the king has for a long time been absent from his kingdom, and that today he is returning, and everyone is going to meet him." "But where is the king?" said the soldier. "I do not see him." "Here he is," answered the huntsman. "I am the king, and have announced my arrival." Then he opened his hunting coat, and his royal garments were visible. The soldier was alarmed, and fell on his knees and begged him to forgive him for having in his ignorance treated him as an equal, and spoken to him by such a name. But the king shook hands with him, and said, "Thou art a brave soldier, and hast saved my life. Thou shalt never again be in want. I will take care of thee, and if ever thou wouldst like to eat a piece of roast meat, as good as that in the robber's house, come to the royal kitchen. But if thou wouldst drink a health, thou must first ask my permission." The 6 Servants. In former times there lived an aged queen who was a sorceress, and her daughter was the most beautiful maiden under the sun. The old woman, however, had no other thought than how to lure mankind to destruction, and when a wooer appeared, she said that whosoever wished to have her daughter must first perform a task or die. Many had been dazzled by the daughter's beauty, and had actually risked this, but they never could accomplish what the old woman enjoined them to do. And then no mercy was shown. They had to kneel down, and their heads were struck off. A certain king's son, who had also heard of the maiden's beauty, said to his father, "Let me go there. I want to demand her in marriage." "Never," answered the king. "If you were to go, it would be going to your death." On this the son lay down and was sick unto death, and for 7 years he lay there, and no physician could heal him. When the father perceived that all hope was over, with a heavy heart he said to him, "Go thither and try your luck, for I know no other means of curing you." When the son heard that, he rose from his bed and was well again, and joyfully set out on his way. And it came to pass that as he was riding across a heath, he saw from afar something like a great heap of hay lying on the ground. And when he drew nearer, he could see that it was the stomach of a man who had laid himself down there, but the stomach looked like a small mountain. When the fat man saw the traveler, he stood up and said, "If you are in need of anyone, take me into your service." The prince answered, "What can I do with such a great big man?" "Oh," said the stout one, "this is nothing. When I stretch myself out well, I am 3,000 times fatter." "If that's the case," said the prince, "I can make use of thee. Come with me." So the stout one followed the prince, and after a while they found another man who was lying on the ground with his ear laid to the turf. "What art thou doing there?" asked the king's son. "I'm listening," replied the man. "What are you listening to so attentively?" "I'm listening to what is going I am listening to what is just going on in the world, for nothing escapes my ears. I even hear the grass growing." "Tell me," said the prince, "what thou hearest at the court of the old queen who has the beautiful daughter." Then he answered, "I hear the whizzing of the sword that is striking off a wooer's head." The king's son said, "I can make use of thee. Come with me." They went onwards, and then saw a pair of feet lying, and part of a pair of legs, but could not see the rest of the body. When they had walked on for a great distance, they came to the body, and at last to the head also. "Why," said the prince, "what a tall rascal thou art." "Oh," replied the tall one, "that is nothing at all yet. When I stretch out my limbs, I am 3,000 times as tall and taller than the highest mountain on earth. I will gladly enter your service if you will take me." "Come with me," said the prince. "I can make use of thee." They went onwards and found a man sitting by the road who had bound up his ears. The prince said to him, "Hast thou weak eyes, that thou canst not look at the light?"
"No," replied the man, "but I must not remove the bandage, for whatsoever I look at with my eyes splits to pieces. My glance is so powerful. If you can use that, I shall be glad to serve you."
"Come with me," replied the king's son. "I can make use of thee." They journeyed onwards and found a man who was lying in the hot sunshine, trembling and shivering all over his body, so that not a limb was still. "How canst thou shiver when the sun is shining so warm?" said the king's son. "Alack," replied the man, "I am of quite a different nature. The hotter it is, the colder I am, and the frost pierces through all my bones, and the colder it is, the hotter I am. In the midst of ice I cannot endure the heat, nor in the midst of fire the cold." "Thou art a strange fellow," said the prince, "but if thou wilt enter my service, follow me." They traveled onwards and saw a man standing who had a long neck and looked about him, and could see all over the mountains. "What art thou looking at so eagerly?" said the king's son. The man replied, "I have such sharp eyes that I can see into every forest and field, and hill and valley all over the world." The prince said, "Come with me if thou wilt, for I am still in want of such a one." And now the king's son and his 6 servants came to the town where the aged queen dwelt. He did not tell her who he was, but said, "If you will give me your beautiful daughter, I will perform any task you set me." The sorceress was delighted to get such a handsome youth as this into her net, and said, "I will set thee 3 tasks, and if thou art able to perform them all, Thou shalt be husband and master of my daughter. What is the first to be? Thou shalt fetch me my ring which I have dropped into the Red Sea. So the king's son went home to his servants and said, The first task is not easy. A ring is to be got out of the Red Sea. Come find some way of doing it. Then the man with the sharp sight said, I will see where it is lying, and looked down into the water and said, It is sticking there on a pointed stone. The tall one carried them thither and said, I will soon get it out, if I could only see it.
Oh, is that all?
Cried the stout one, and lay down and put his mouth to the water, on which all the waves fell into it, just as if he had been a whirlpool, and he drank up the whole sea till it was dry as a meadow. The tall one stooped down a little, and brought out the ring with his hand. The king's son rejoiced when he had the ring, and took it to the old queen. She was astonished and said, Yes, it is the right ring. Thou hast safely performed the first task. But now comes the second. Dost thou see a meadow in front of my palace? 300 fat oxen are feeding there, and these must thou eat, skin, hair, bones, horns, and all. And down below in my cellar lie 300 casks of wine, and these thou must drink up as well. And if one hair of the oxen, or one little drop of the wine is left, thy life will be forfeited to me. May I invite no guests to this repast? Inquired the prince. No dinner is good without some company. The old woman laughed maliciously and replied, Thou mayest invite one for the sake of companionship, but no more. The king's son went to his servants and said to the stout one, Thou shalt be my guest today, and shalt eat thy fill. Hereupon the stout one stretched himself out and ate the 300 oxen without leaving one single hair. And then he asked if he was to have nothing but his breakfast. He drank the wine straight from the casks without feeling any need of a glass, and he licked the last drop from his fingernails. When the meal was over, the prince went to the old woman and told her that the second task also was performed. She wondered at this and said, No one has ever done so much before, but one task still remains. And she thought to herself, Thou shalt not escape me, and wilt not keep thy head on thy shoulders this night. Said she, I will bring my daughter to thee in thy chamber, and thou shalt put thine arms around her, and when you are sitting there together, beware of falling asleep. When 12 o'clock is striking, I will come, and if she is then no longer in thine arms, thou art lost. The prince thought, The task is easy. I will most certainly keep my eyes open. Nevertheless, he called his servants, told them what the old woman had said, and remarked, Who knows what treachery lurks behind this? Foresight is a good thing. Keep watch, and take care that the maiden does not go out of my room again. When night fell, the old woman came with her daughter, and gave her into the prince's arms, and then the tall one wound himself round the two in a circle, and the stout one placed himself by the door, so that no living creature could enter. There the two sat, and the maiden spake never a word, but the moon shone through the window on her face, and the prince could behold her wondrous beauty. He did nothing but gaze at her, and was filled with love and happiness, and his eyes never felt weary. This lasted until 11 o'clock, when the old woman cast such a spell over all of them that they fell asleep, and at the self-same moment the maiden was carried away. Then they all slept soundly until 11:45, when the magic lost its power, and all awoke again. Oh, misery and misfortune, cried the prince. Now I am lost. The faithful servants also began to lament, but the listeners said, Be quiet, I want to listen. Then he listened for an instant and said, She is on a rock 300 leagues from hence, bewailing her fate. Thou alone, tall one, canst help her. If thou wilt stand up, thou wilt be there in a couple of steps."
"Yes," answered the tall one, "but the one with the sharp eyes must go with me, that we may destroy the rock."
Then the tall one took the one with bandages on his back, and in the twinkling of an eye, they were on the enchanted rock. The tall one immediately took the bandage from the other's eyes, and he did but look round, and the rock shivered into 1,000 pieces. Then the tall one took the maiden in his arms, carried her back in a second, then fetched his companion with the same rapidity, and before it struck 12, they were all sitting as they had sat before, quite merrily and happily. When 12 struck, the aged sorceress came stealing in with a malicious face, which seemed to say, "Now he is mine." For she believed that her daughter was on the rock 300 leagues off. But then she saw her in the prince's arms. She was alarmed and said, "Here is one who knows more than I do." She dared not make any opposition, and was forced to give him her daughter. But she whispered in her ear, "It is a disgrace to thee to have to obey common people, and that thou art not allowed to choose a husband to thine own liking." On this, the proud heart of the maiden was filled with anger, and she meditated revenge. Next morning, she caused 300 great bundles of wood to be got together, and said to the prince that though the 3 tasks were performed, she still would not be his wife until someone was ready to seat himself in the midst of the wood and bear the fire. She thought that none of his servants would let themselves be burnt for him, and that out of love for her, he himself would place himself upon it, and then she would be free. But the servants said, "Every one of us has done something except the frosty one. He must set to work." And they put him in the middle of the pile and set fire to it. Then the fire began to burn, and burnt for 3 days until all the wood was consumed. And when the flames had burnt out, the frosty one was standing amid the ashes, trembling like an aspen leaf, and saying, "I never felt such a frost during the whole course of my life. If it had lasted much longer, I should have been benumbed." As no other pretext was to be found, the beautiful maiden was now forced to take the unknown youth as a husband. But when they drove away to church, the old woman said, "I cannot endure the disgrace," and sent her warriors after them with orders to cut down all who opposed them and bring back her daughter. But the listener had sharpened his ears and heard the secret discourse of the old woman. "What shall we do?" said he to the stout one. But he knew what to do, and spat out once or twice behind the carriage some of the sea water which he had drunk, and a great sea arose in which the warriors were caught and drowned. When the sorceress perceived that, she sent her mailed knights. But the listener heard the rattling of their armor, and undid the bandage from one eye of Sharp Eyes, who looked for a while rather fixedly at the enemy's troops, on which they all sprang to pieces like glass. Then the youth and the maiden went on their way undisturbed. And when the 2 had been blessed in church, the 6 servants took leave and said to their master, "Your wishes are now satisfied. You need us no longer. We will go our way and seek our fortunes." Half a league from the palace of the prince's father was a village near, which a swineherd tended his herd, and when they came thither, the prince said to his wife, "Do you know who I really am? I am no prince, but a herder of swine, and the man who is there with that herd is my father. We 2 shall have to set to work also and help him." Then he alighted with her at the inn, and secretly told the innkeepers to take away her royal apparel during the night. So when she awoke in the morning, she had nothing to put on, and the innkeeper's wife gave her an old gown and a pair of worsted stockings, and at the same time seemed to consider it a great present, and said, "If it were not for the sake of your husband, I should have given you nothing at all." Then the princess believed that he really was a swineherd and tended the herd with him, and thought to herself, "I have deserved this for my haughtiness and pride." This lasted for a week, and then she could endure it no longer, for she had sores on her feet, and now came a couple of people who asked if she knew who her husband was. "Yes," she answered, "he is a swineherd, and had just gone out with cords and ropes to try to drive a little bargain." But they said, "Just come with us, and we will take you to him." And they took her up to the palace, and when she entered the hall, there stood her husband in kingly raiment. But she did not recognize him until he took her in his arms, kissed her, and said, "I suffered much for thee, and now thou too hast had to suffer for me." And then the wedding was celebrated, and he who has told you all this wishes that he, too, had been present at it. The Lord's animals and the devils. The Lord God had created all animals, and had chosen out the wolf to be his dog, but he had forgotten the goat. Then the devil made ready, and began to create also, and created goats with fine long tails. Now when they went to pasture, they generally remained caught in the hedges by their tails. Then the devil had to go there and dismantle them with a great deal of trouble. This enraged him at last, and he went and bit off the tail of every goat, as may be seen to this day by the stump. Then he let them go to pasture alone. But it came to pass that the Lord God perceived how at one time they gnawed away at a fruitful tree, at another injured the noble vines, or destroyed other tender plants. This distressed him, so that in his goodness and mercy he summoned his wolves, and soon tore in pieces the goats that went there. When the devil observed this, he went before the Lord and said, "Thy creatures have destroyed mine." The Lord answered, "Why didst thou create things to do harm?" The devil said, "I was compelled to do it, inasmuch as my thoughts run on evil. What I create can have no other nature, and thou must pay me heavy damages. I will pay thee as soon as the oak leaves fall. Come then, thy money will then be ready counted out." When the oak leaves had fallen, the devil came and demanded what was due to him. But the Lord said, "In the church of Constantinople stands a tall oak tree, which still has all its leaves." With raging and curses the devil departed, and went to seek the oak, wandered in the wilderness for 6 months before he found it, and when he returned, all the oaks had in the meantime covered themselves again with green leaves. Then he had to forfeit his indemnity, and in his rage he put out the eyes of all the remaining goats, and put his own in instead. This is why all goats have devil's eyes, and their tails bitten off, and why he likes to assume their shape.